40% Merlot, 40% Malbec, and 20%
It's
Cab
good for you.
Welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, the world in your glass.
Hi, this is Niels Bernstein, food editor for Wine Enthusiast. Lemon meringue pie and beer? Oh yeah. As you might have noticed, food and drink pairing in restaurants these days means a lot more than just white or red wine. We're seeing beverage directors suggesting beer, cider, sake, spirits, mixed drinks, with everything from salads to shellfish to steaks to dessert. In this podcast, we'll talk to some experts about why you should open your mind to some less conventional pairings.
Hi, my name is Ariel Arce, and I'm the owner of Air Champagne Parlor and Tokyo Record Bar.
When you talk about pairing, obviously food and wine people talk about tend to be very basic. What they might have champagne at the beginning of a meal or at the end. But for you, how do you like to drink champagne and sparkling wines with food?
For me, with food, I think that champagne is the most versatile wine that you can use. There's so much acid in champagne that generally it's a pretty easy pair. There's only two foods I generally stay away from, one of which is spice, and the other is very, very heavy, rich, spicy flavors. But everything else is a really wonderful pair. You're never going to find that a glass of champagne is going to be too powerful to eat with any sort of rich style foods or foods with a lot of kind of flavor and character. Right. So what I like to do is actually kind of break down the flavor profiles of the champagnes and think about them more as their own identities of flavors and then pair them with foods accordingly.
So what might be an example of a champagne type and foods that might go with that style?
Sure. So champagne is a very interesting wine because it has a lot of different styles. So you have champagnes that are actually blended from multiple grapes, or you have champagnes that are single grape varietals. And then you also have aging, which gives more flavor or body or texture or complexity to a wine. So when thinking about champagne, it can run the gamut and the spectrum of flavors from everything from just deep minerality to apples and pears to currants to cherries to strawberries and berries to then getting into more savory notes like toasted almonds and honeysuckles and mints and these really kind of more herbaceous undertones and vegetal tones.
Right. And all of those flavors that you mentioned are things that are incredibly versatile in themselves in terms of food and culinary use and everything else. Do you, with a sweetness level, a Brut Nature versus a Brut, how would that affect what you might pair a champagne with?
Brut Nature is a very kind of tricky subject because it technically means that there's no sugar in it or added to it. But they can range from being very light to being very rich in style, depending on how luscious the vintage was or, how cold it was. So therefore, it didn't have a lot of sugar. So I always find that I like to find out what the base grape of the wine is. Be it Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, you're essentially going to have a very different wine. And when they get to the lighter side, I generally tend to stay with lighter foods, of course. So, this is why champagne and seafood, shellfish, flavors that are very light and salinic and bright always pair very well with champagne. But then when you're thinking about Brut Nature with Pinot Noir, they get a bit more richer and more curranted. So you can go anywhere from doing that with light vegetables to even with a steak sometimes if you're doing something that's very lightly salted and smoked or spiced. Yeah,
I was going to say I had recently at a restaurant a grilled ribeye that was paired with it was a richer style. It wasn't a rosé champagne, but it was a richer style of champagne. And it was incredible. I mean, you talk about the acidity, which is a big part of it. But of course, another huge part of pairing food with champagne is the texture and the cleansing effect that the bubbles have with fattier foods. What are some of the other, besides acidity, some of the other characteristics of champagne that tend to make it versatile with food?
Absolutely. I mean, rosé is such a fun category to talk about because there's so many variations within rosé. And I always like to say those are my steak wines. Yeah. Those are actually the most versatile when I try to introduce someone to a new style of champagne, because you can go as light and floral as maybe generally think of rosé, to really tannic and really rich, and really like full bodied, deep, rich, spicy kind of cherries and fuller flavors. So for me, again, I really like to go back to kind of breaking down the flavors of a wine, and then I think about how those things work. So when I think about apples and pears and light green notes, I think of what I would normally eat apples and pears with. So you think about nutty textures, you think about herbaceous textures and flavors, and then you can kind of very easily find comparable pairs. With champagne, it's much easier to complement than to try to match. Right. So when you get into heavier, more kind of oaky, woody, fuller, dynamic, complex flavors, I generally like to balance them out with maybe a lighter style food rather than trying to match them with heavy, rich foods like something cooked in butter, something cooked in heavy oil, something with a lot of, spice, or, something straight off a grill. Like instead, I find that I'd rather do a wine that has a lot of flavors with something that it's going to kind of support, rather than the two combating one another.
I think it's interesting. There's sous videing is such a trend right now. And I find that with sous videed meats and seafoods, champagne can be really amazing because you're not getting a lot of charred notes or a lot of burnt notes. You're just getting the subtlety of the meat itself, which can be really amazing with a range of champagnes. Some people say that to bring out a lot of the complexity of champagne, the temperature that it's served at can make a difference. That maybe colder temperatures might bring out more citrus notes, warmer temperatures, more richer notes. Is that something that can affect what foods you might pair champagne with? Or
Totally. Actually, when I think about climate, the colder it is, the less you're actually going to pull out of a wine. Right. So we've been conditioned to drink our champagne really cold. And if I'm sitting poolside and I want a really nice icy glass of champagne, for me, I tend to drink the non-vintage, blended wines, something that's really bright and crispy. And then you are just going to get those light acids, those apples, those pears, those lime zests and lemon zests, whatever the nature of the wine. But once you let a wine come to temperature, not exactly room temperature, that's not the most pleasurable way to drink champagne. But technically, if you let it come down, you're going to find the disconnect between the sugar and the acid. The wine will inevitably start to show its characteristics because it's warm and it's loose and it's alive. So depending on what temperature you're serving the wine at, you are going to pull out different notes. But a wine is only going to be as expressive as it is. Right. So it's really dependent on the wine itself. If you're drinking these fresh, non-vintage wines with a lot of acidity to them, even if they're room temperature, you're still going to get those acids. Right. It's really about expressing the sugar more once you start lowering the temperature. So what you're saying is, a lot of people think of pairing champagne throughout a meal with a salad, with soup, with a main dish, with dessert is kind of a radical concept. But the way you're talking about it is the way you talk about wine in general. Champagne is a wine. It's one of the world's great wines. And the concerns in terms of pairing champagne with food are the same as pairing any wine with food. Absolutely. I mean, I just like to say that champagne is wine 2.0. It's just wine with bubbles. And we're in a really lucky age now where we have so many winemakers that are so thoughtful and so sophisticated that they are not thinking about bubbles first. They're thinking about what is underneath the effervescence and using the effervescence to support it. And so for me, if you are only drinking kind of big brand wines that you're not really getting to experience at the right temperature or in the right glass, then inevitably you're not seeing the range of champagne and the range of really kind of thoughtfully made wines. Right. So the message is drink more champagne, drink it more often, and drink it with any foods you want. Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you so much. Of course.
Hi, my name is David Dolginow. I'm the co-founder of Shacksbury Cider in Vergennes, Vermont.
So let's talk about pairing cider with food. Cider is not something you typically see paired in restaurants, but it actually is incredibly versatile with food. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. You know, the cider industry started in this recent resurgence with sweeter, bubbly ciders, but is now definitely moving more and more toward dry and food-friendly ciders, and they have an amazing versatility with all kinds of different foods.
And there's history there, right? I mean, with Basque cider.
Exactly, yeah. In the Basque region, one of the world-class regions for food and beverage, they have a very long-standing cider tradition, and it's a very unique style. It's a bone-dry cider, and it's high in acidity, and so it pairs beautifully with high, like fattier, saltier foods. And so at the Basque cider houses, they typically have a fixed menu, and so you first have a cod omelet, and then chorizo cooked in the cider, chorizo la sidra, and then chuleta, which is basically a big T-bone steak, and they serve that at probably 20 or 30 or even more different cider houses all throughout the Basque region, and those salty, fatty foods just pair beautifully with the high acid cider.
And here we might pair very different wines with each of those dishes, but there they're going cider, cider, cider.
Yeah, and I think that nowadays you can really take cider in a variety of different directions. The fact that they have put cider with red meat, I think, is particularly interesting because, in the United States, we laud the sort of cab sauv, classic cab sauv with the steak. But in fact, a nice lean acidic cider can be a wonderful balance to, a really beautiful steak.
So what, generally speaking, obviously there's a lot of different types of ciders. You were talking about the Basque style, but kind of as a whole, what about cider makes it food friendly?
Yeah, so I think where it and one of the reasons why cider is here to stay and it's not just another fad is because of how well it complements food. So cider is lower alcohol than wine typically, and because of that, it is a little more delicate, I would say. But at the same time, it is lighter bodied than beer, and so it kind of serves this other role in food pairings, and it's just another tool in the toolkit that people have to find different ciders that might work with different foods.
You were telling me earlier when we were talking that you and your brother have a tradition when you get together. What's that?
Yeah, so we both love Ottolenghi's quinoa salad with the herbs and pomegranate and citrus. And so when we get together, we often end up hosting at least one or two dinners. And the salad is a fixture of our dinners together. And it just works beautifully with our Arlo cider, which is light and fruity, but still has really nice acidity. And it's just a really fun, casual, healthful way to open up a social occasion.
Now, you produce a range of ciders yourself. So when you're talking kind of a almost bone-dry cider versus one with a bit more residual sugar, how might that differ as far as what foods you'd pair them with?
Yeah. So right after we finished this podcast interview, my partner and I and Alex are heading to Momofuku for dinner. And Momofuku Sambar has been serving our semi-dry cider, and it is an incredible pairing with some of those big, flavorful dishes that they create.
And you're talking about some really powerful Korean and other Asian flavors, and with sweetness and spice and things that one might think is hard to pair wine with.
Yeah, absolutely. When we first started Shacksbury, we experimented with a bunch of dishes for a series of dinners that we were hosting, and really settled on David Chang's recipe for bo sam, which is a Korean-style pork butt. You basically take the pork butt or pork shoulder, you put on a very hefty layer of salt and some sugar, and then you slow roast it for many hours, and it kind of caramelizes and melds, and it's this salty, sweet, fatty, just beautiful chorus of flavors. And again, the semi-dry cider that we make has really nice tannins to kind of hold the structure and to balance out those big flavors. But at the same time, with the really the more spicy sauces that he puts with it, the Somm sauce being the most typical one, I think. I think the appley character of our cider, along with the tannins, really works in balancing out the spice, but also, holding up a bit to those flavors.
And there's, of course, the cleansing effect of the bubbles. Beer and sparkling wine people would say the same thing, that part of that scrubbing bubbles effect can be really great with fatty foods and just as a cleansing effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, without knowing for sure, the vast majority of cider in the United States has some amount of effervescence. Not the level of a champagne, but probably the level of a beer, and that is, I think, a nice amount of effervescence can do just that. Pair and work with the food, and not distract you from the food.
So I find it surprising, to be honest, that more restaurants don't offer a cider by the glass in their kind of glass lineup. What would you suggest to restaurants, wine directors, how they might introduce cider into their repertoire?
Yeah, I think a good way to approach cider today is to have both a sweet cider offering, because that's where a lot of cider drinkers are today, and also a dry food-driven offering, whether it's a traditional European cider or one of the many domestic producers today that are making really incredible, food-driven complex ciders. And by offering one of each, I think you can you can kind of capture where the cider market is today.
So you've talked about the two of your go-tos with cider are Mexican cuisine and Chinese. And we talked about Korean, some of the Korean flavors that, wouldn't say Momofuku is traditional Korean food, but certainly those are some of those intense, sweet, spicy Korean flavors. Yeah. Are there any other cuisines that jump to mind that are go-tos for you with cider?
Yeah, so, Nils, so I'm a native Kansas Cityan, so I would be doing a disservice to my heritage if we didn't make some ciders that went really well with barbecue.
Absolutely.
And
cider, of course, has a very long, rich history in the United States, so it's really a very patriotic pairing.
Absolutely, in this absolutely the same way that barbecue does. So when I go home this July 4th to Kansas City, you bet my dad will be smoking at least 2 or 3 slabs of ribs and a brisket, and we will be drinking loads and loads of our just dry farmhouse cider. And again, it has the tannin to hold up to those big flavors of the pork ribs and the beef brisket, but then at the same time enough kind of appliness to refresh, and the bubbles, like you were saying, to help cleanse and refresh as you're going back and forth between bites. So.
Well, you sold me, so thanks so much, and I'll see you at Momofuku tonight.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nils.
Hi, my name is Courtenay Greenleaf. I am the Corporate Beverage Director with Rosa Mexicano.
Thanks, Courtenay. So we're talking about a subject near and dear to my heart, which is agave spirits, tequila and mezcal, to simplify it. And we're talking about pairing, kind of unconventional pairings with food. Now, I happen to think that agave spirits and food go incredibly well together. There's a lot of savory, herbal, fruit characteristics that go with a variety of food, not just Mexican. Off the top of your head, what do you think when you think of pairing agave spirits with food?
I think it's the most spectacular pairing of two things together. And one of my personal favorites, you're asking me my first thought, I do find myself amongst a lot of varieties of different mezcal pairing with chocolate. Ooh. Which is my personal.
All right, now we're talking.
Agave spirits lend such a diverse nuances. As you're saying, there's the savory, you have floral nuances, citrus, you have earthiness, you have funkiness. And then you talk about other, if you're doing any aging, you then can talk about, the oak.
And what do agave spirits have that maybe a way that you wouldn't pair, say, a vodka or a whiskey or something else.
Well, I feel that the agave spirit can lend so much complexity in one particular distillation. So you are getting either that floral note, and then it switches into this, getting other sweet agave notes, but then you're getting this earthiness. So it and being mostly batch proof right out of the still. Right. You're not blending it, diluting it with any water. So it's just a batch proof spirit. So you're really truly getting a beautiful distillate.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's just so much, I'll repeat myself again, complexity that it allows for such a beautiful experience with any pairing.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny because I think for a lot of people, the idea of pairing a straight spirit with food is really unexpected. But to hear you talk about it, you're really using wine language in a sense. You're talking about citrus and earth and mineral and floral and these qualities that are in a straight mezcal or tequila or a good one. That's really what you're also getting in a lot of great wines.
Yeah, absolutely. Terroir, it's everything that
it's
comes.
The beauty of it.
And I think that maybe some people are hesitant about it being a high proof spirit. They associate mixing, and that's not a problem. That's still delicious, sure. But to really get the true nuance and the statement of that distillate, it's right there in that just single glass.
I think a lot of people think, okay, Mexican food. I love drinking margaritas with Mexican food. Yeah, I pair agave spirits, but we're really talking about something different. You really want to get that terroir, that essence of the spirit is really best by tasting it straight with the food.
Yeah. I love drinking mezcal, as I said, chocolate, some other rich foods, even wonderful with ceviches and a nice grilled fish. Eating a beautiful ribeye the other day, had a nice madroquiche mezcal. And then also, me and my fiance, we love to have a ramen with it, and it's that richness of that broth so yes, there's so many avenues.
You heard it here first. Ramen and mezcal. Oh my God, it sounds amazing. There's I think for me, a lot of grilled meats are amazing with a more traditionally made mezcal, because you get these kind of roasty, charred notes in the mezcal that can kind of complement each other.
Yeah, it's the big characteristics, of the mezcal, and having a nice, hearty piece of protein. They stand up to each other, and can really have a great conversation. And it's just, if you're getting, I also feel like a nice marbled piece, and you're getting that alcohol that kind of can cut through with such strong statements on the palate. But yeah, it's such an amazing thing. And what's interesting is I found is that mezcals are so diverse with their flavor, with the nuances on the palate. I mean, you could have something that's very just super floral, or you could have a mezcal that just really is fruit forward, or even sometimes have that cheese kind of funk note to it. I was once doing a cheese and mezcal pairing just for my own exploration, and I was just shocked where I was like, this is amazing, and oh my God, this is so wrong. Wow. So it's interesting.
I was also doing a cheese and mezcal pairing yesterday for my own exploration. I just didn't think to call it work. Genius. And when you talk about the diversity in mezcal, you're talking about not just the different agaves that they use, but also the production process as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because some mezcals, have been elevated and brought to a more larger production, and
very diplomatic there.
Correct. Yes. And others, are still in their very small palenques and so artisanal, and their cooking techniques, are still, using, your earthen oven, but also allowing, depending on what type of ovens you are using, and also what type of wood you are using, will impart different flavors into the agave as it's cooking.
And it really has a nice way of transmitting terroir, like you're talking about, both in the agaves that are used to make it and the cooking process. You might actually get some of that, whatever wood they're using, for example. It has a funny way of when it's made in a traditional way of really transmitting that through to the final spirit.
That's the beauty of also that complexity that lends itself with the production.
Well, it's, when you talk about wine, a lot of times people are resistant to pair high alcohol wines with food, but you're talking about where the alcohol can really be a strength in a sense, because it can kind of affect the texture of it, and also just that strength can cut fattiness or richness in food as well.
And that's where I feel like I'm drawn towards when it comes to like the real pairings. But regardless, I mean, you could have a beautiful also Highlands tequila that also, so we're talking about, tequila, and that has more citrus and kind of floral, citrus fruit forward notes. That could also be beautifully paired too with a refreshing ceviche or a nice, mango or sorbet.
I find with mezcal and tequila, when you talk about cask strength, how it, without watering it down to say 38 or 40%, I find, I'm not sure if you agree, but when they do come, let's say between 46 and 54%, they actually tend to have kind of a smoother feel in a way. They have a richer texture, a fuller flavor, and for me, they go down smoother at a slightly higher proof.
Yeah, and either if it's the right person who's doing that distillation and they know what they're doing, then then all right, all for it. Yeah. But I do feel it just it has. It's fun to taste, because sometimes you're tasting the heat right on your palate, and then you're surprised. It's warm, but it's not heat. Yeah. And then it's interesting because then there could also be some tequilas that I may taste that have been diluted, where you're like on the palate immediately it feels soft, but as it's going down, it's hot.
The important thing is to try as many as you can, learn as much as you can about it, and now for people who are still a bit resistant to sipping straight tequila or mezcal with some food, what might be some, let's say, entry-level cocktails that might still express the flavor that might lead them to wanting to try it straight later?
Well, as we all know, one of the most popular cocktails in the world is a margarita. So let's just go with that. It's always complemented, the agave spirit, by the citrus of your lime and your sweetener that you choose. If it's your simple syrup or agave or an orange liqueur, and that salt, it's just a nice little wrapper. But I also tend to find a lot of success with suggesting pineapple. Pineapple is such a complementary ingredient next to any agave spirit. If it's the mezcal or even a raicilla, it really it's a nice bonding for the two. Another way that I also find that is appreciated and people are really excited by it is just taking any classic cocktail and replacing it with an agave spirit. So
a mezcal Negroni, a mezcal Old Fashioned.
Yes, I have not ever prepared a classic cocktail that did not taste absolutely wonderful. Replacing it with the spirit, and to me, it just shows too that it is such a diverse. The agave spirits have such a diversity of flavors and characteristics.
Well, and it shows that both their ability to stand out when paired with a lot of different flavors, but also shows their versatility, that they align with a lot of flavors as well. And when you talk about those kind of sweet, citric, nutty, pineapple, grapefruit, whatever, you can extend that to food. So foods that might have the same elements in them are likely to pair well.
Absolutely agreed with you.
I wish you could see us now, because our eyes are sparkling like stars in the night just talking about mezcal and tequila. So I got to rush out tonight and pair an incredible mezcal with it's kind of a hot summer night, maybe some grilled fish. We'll see what happens. Well, thanks so much, Courtenay.
Thank you.
I'm Adam Vavrick, beer director for the Publican Anchor, Publican Tavern at O'Hare, and Publican Quality Meats in Chicago, Illinois.
How do you remember all that?
I don't know, considering how much I drink.
That's right. So we're talking about pairing beverages with food. Unfortunately, a lot of people still think in terms of wine and food pairing. You're the beer director for the Publican. What does that entail exactly?
I do all the beer programming, so I'm the one that's selecting what the list is, making sure that everything's executed properly, doing glass pours, cellarmanship at Anchor involving cask ales, doing somewhat more public-friendly stuff at Tavern at O'Hare, and just being the overall beer guy. They hired me because I'm something of like a beer raconteur, I'm the storyteller, but I got my chops behind me to do it.
And part of that is talking about the story of how well beer pairs with the food.
Absolutely. Beer and food is something I've been a big fan of for many years. Being in beer for a decade, I've done plenty of beer and food pairings, both professionally and for fun. Beer has, Randy Mosher, I think, is a big fan of saying that beer has the one thing that wine doesn't when it comes to food pairings, which is carbonation. And those bubbles of CO2 or carbon dioxide give you an almost like scrubbing bubbles kind of effect where it cleanses the palate after each bite. So you can do things with beer and food that you cannot do with wine and food. And as much as I enjoy wine and food, as much as I enjoy, a really good Cab Franc with a steak, there's so many other pairings out there that work really well. And really most sommeliers and people that really enjoy wine will be totally honest about the blind spots that wine has with beer. And, honestly, the credit to wine is that when it does work, it's one of those, it's like an epiphany kind of moment where your brain explodes and you go, holy crap, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever had. I have this wonderful memory of having, like a beautiful fresh made shrimp ceviche with a Pinot Grigio that it blew up, and it was just, everything worked so beautifully. The lime worked with that fruit character in the Pinot, and the tannin worked with the sharpness and the acidity from the tomato and the onion. It was just one of those things that just worked beautifully. What I try to do with beer when I do beer pairings is I don't need to do that every time, but what I do like to do, rather than match intensity, is really to show affinity. And what I mean by that is I had a great experience the other day with a brewery owner from San Diego who happened to be in town, and he did our tasting menu at Publican, which is where the chefs choose the entire thing, and they'll call audibles all the time, so everything's out on the fly, and it's just really, really interesting stuff, and it makes my life a lot of fun to be able to pair that because I have 12 things on tap and I have a whole bottle list. And anyway, the dish at the time was this really interesting black sea bass poached in like a porcini and pork broth, and I'm sitting there thinking umami, 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 and, it's very easy to go with something like a Vienna Amber or whatever, something like malty that you'd expect. I went with an Imperial Stout, and specifically an Imperial Stout from 2012, because yeast dies, and that dead yeast gives you a very distinct soy and umami flavor that matched not only the earthiness and that kind of rich, savory character of the mushroom, but it also worked on the glaze itself on the fish. And it was just, it blew him away, and I had to take a bite, and it blew me away.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Because
not many people will pair an Imperial Stout with fish, because you think fish, you think delicate. And I like to describe this as my friend Steven, who's a musician, likes to say, if there's not a threat of catastrophic failure, then it's not a live show. I kind of come to the same conclusion when it comes to pairings. Like, it's how we learn, and it's how we grow, and it's the experience that matters. That's
an incredible attitude. What are some beer styles and foods that you think are great pairings? Does anything come to mind?
Absolutely. Belgian beer is sort of the default, just because of the complexity and usually the alcohol level. 2, 3 in, you might not care as much. But I'm a really big fan of saison with most foods, and saisons, the farmhouse ales, for those that don't know, come out of the tradition of farmhands drinking beer as provision beer throughout the farming season. They're usually a little bit spicy, but effervescent and generally clean. They might have a little bit of funk, but it depends on the producer. They're very food friendly because the malt base is typically neutral, but neutral in the way a water cracker is neutral. So if you're eating something that has that bread, or like if you've got something on a fatunta, or if you've got breadcrumbs on something, or something that might be like fried and glutinous, like it works. Saisons are kind of my saisons and triples for that exact same reason are always my go-to as a pairing. And what's fun about beer is that generally you want to match intensities, but you can also match on opposites in a way that you can't really do in wine. One of the common wine pairings is like red wine and chocolate. I like doing something that's way lighter in character, something with acid to it, like a Berliner Weiss, or again, one of these Saisons that has carbonic acid from being so highly carbonated with chocolate, because chocolate is very mouth coating. Even if it's bitter, you still have that ability to kind of wipe it clean at the end from that carbonation.
It's interesting because we talk a lot about texture with wine, but really with beers, it's almost more pronounced and more important to think about in terms of pairing.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with the trend to have a lot more barrel aging, and that adds vanillin, which adds a really interesting mouthfeel from the oak. And you also get tannin, depending on what was in there before. And you also can get tannin. A lot of people are using things like wine grapes and wine skins and so on. So you have a whole nother dimension that you get to work with when it comes to what that liquid actually feels like in your mouth, which I think is just fascinating and works very well from a culinary perspective.
So if we're talking about more malt-forward beers versus more hops-forward beers, how would that affect what types of foods you might pair beer with?
Again, the default is always, you go culturally. If you think about something like a really rich malty Dopplebock, obviously you're going to want to pair that with something like pork or, something like that, or lamb or schnitzel, exactly. But it can also be really fun in the dessert setting, because a lot of desserts nowadays, people are trying to make them a little bit more I don't want to say light or less dense, but the flavor profile is more savory and comes from that culinary mindset. And so you look at something, not necessarily like a creme brulee, but something that has like something flambéed on there, that Maillard reaction, that browning of sugars, is the exact same thing that's happening in that Doppelbock. And so you have that burnt sugar character. And again, all you really need to do is to match that intensity. And that's huge. But I like Doppelbocks with like a lemon meringue pie too, because it literally is the opposite. That lemon meringue gives that bright acid and sort of light fluffiness that is completely opposite, but no less intense, of that dense, malty, bready Doppelbock that kind of matches that crust depending on how it's done.
What about these very strong, very hoppy, quad IPAs, et cetera? Do they have any hope with food?
Oh, yeah, very much so. One of the classic, and this is straight out of the textbook of Randy, who I mentioned earlier, Garrett Oliver from Brooklyn. Again, it's intensities. Blue cheese is one of the biggest pairings for a big double IPA, because it's so citrusy and so bright that you're kind of matching with funk and blue cheese, especially some of these really like veiny, like chunky blues are like, they're extraordinarily intense. You need something that can back that up. And you also have alcohol, which alcohol kind of brings this interesting heat to whatever you're doing, and the carbonation cuts right through the creaminess. Right. So you have that balance there. I'll go on record. I'm not the biggest fan of blue cheese, honestly, but in the right scenario, those things can work very well together.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Well, thanks, Adam. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Definitely. Thanks for having me on.
This podcast is produced by Large Media, LARJ Media. Wine Enthusiast is made possible by grapes, sunshine, and wine, and by the hard-working editors who bring you news and information on your favorite beverage every day. If you like what we're doing, share our podcast with your friends and give us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For more fun wine information, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Wine Enthusiast.